Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. The United States was the first country to separate church and state. Who came up with the idea? Our guest today will tell us.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Who invented the American ideal of religious freedom? Our guest today, Stephen K. Green, will tell us. Stephen Green is the Fred H. Paulus Professor of Law and Affiliated Professor of History and Religious Studies at Willamette University, where he teaches constitutional law, First Amendment, legal history, jurisprudence, and education law in the College of Law, and he teaches legal history and American religious history in the College of Arts and Sciences. He's participated in several significant state church cases before the United States Supreme Court, and is the author of 7 books, including Inventing a Christian America, The Myth of the Religious Founding, and Separating Church and State, A History.
Professor Green's newest book is called The Grand Collaboration, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the Invention of American Religious Freedom. Welcome to Freethought Matters, Professor.
Thank you.
So, Professor Green, I was reading an article about you in which you were quoted saying that you went to law school after taking an undergrad civil rights course that had inspired your belief that the law can be used to do good. And most of us don't think of the law as being very exciting as a profession, but I understand that in your early days as a lawyer, you had some adventures.
Yeah, yes, I did. I was actually been very fortunate in my legal career. I actually started out after I clerked for an appellate court as a legal services attorney in Alaska, working with Native Americans on various issues. I would fly over basically about half the western part of the state in Bush Plains, meeting up with clients. And so that was actually quite exciting to do that kind of work.
So why did you gravitate to constitutional law and in particular to defending the principle of separation between religion and government?
Well, I actually come from a long line of Protestant ministers. I'll recite all of them. I was just never religious enough to follow in my father's footsteps. But I always found I found fascinating this overlap between religion and politics and then law, and how religion is such low-hanging fruit, so to speak, when people want to somehow justify their policies, and how it's been misused throughout history all the time. And so that led me to want to specialize in church and state. So I went on and got my master's and PhD in American religious history and constitutional history.
Well, that is such a great way to put it. It's low-hanging fruit.
So we have read some of your earlier books. We've even talked to you about one of your earlier books, and you've written in your books about the contributions that Thomas Jefferson made and James Madison made to religious freedom. But I understand you realize there weren't any books on their joint collaboration on religious freedom. So your book is titled The Grand Collaboration, brings them together into kind of like a dual biography. So, did Jefferson and Madison invent religious freedom as a team?
It was very collaborative between the two of them. And I say in the book, at the introduction, that to say the invention of American religious freedom would be controversial in history circles. because I fully acknowledge that the origins of impulses for American religious freedom go way back before the two men. There are a variety of different people and thought patterns that influence them. But what I'm trying to concentrate on here is the notion of American religious freedom that predominated throughout most of U.S. history is attributable to Jefferson and Madison. They were more involved in our creation of this idea than anyone else. Not that they invented it at day one, but the current, up until recently, I should say, version of American religious freedom really is due to them.
Yeah, you mentioned that they were influenced by, like the Whigs in Great Britain, some of their protests of the clerics, right?
Both men were extremely highly educated for the time and very educated in various forms of political philosophy. And so consequently, what was influential to them primarily, even though both of them went to religious colleges, what was influential to them was Enlightenment thought and then the radical Whig political thought of the middle of the 18th century that was against the British crown. And those writers were what really Jefferson incorporated into his various writings, like the Declaration of Independence.
So we've all heard how many Europeans escaped religious tyranny to seek freedom in America. I have an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower, although I'm proud he was not a pilgrim, he was a tutor. But if this is the case, why did Jefferson and Madison even need to invent this new version of religious freedom?
Because of the reality of colonial America was not one that really fostered religious freedom at all. That they brought, whether it was the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Anglicans, you name it, they brought the old European models with them to the colonies. And they quickly got into the same type of practices. I mean, the adage is just some people fled Europe for religious freedom, and as soon as they got here, they became religiously intolerant of everybody else. It was religious freedom for me, not religious freedom for the rest of you. And that was the prevailing pattern, that at the cusp of the Revolution, 9 of the 13 colonies had established churches, which wasn't just that you had to pay money if you were a dissenter to the majority religion, but it affected your civil rights all the time, whether you could marry, divorce, whether you could have your children baptized or not. All these things mattered on whether you were in the prevailing religion or not. So that was the common practice.
There's that old joke that the Pilgrims loved religious freedom so much that they kept it all to themselves.
That's more or less what it was like.
Yeah.
The history really of the colonial period is more of religious intolerance.
So how did the Baptist imprisonment in Virginia have an impact on the young James Madison?
Well, Madison went to Princeton, which was a strict Presbyterian college, and he actually had considered becoming a minister himself. So there's really an early period in his late teens, early 20s, where he's actually, in some ways, we think he is more religious than later. But what he was most upset with, because he was also taught in Princeton this idea of you need to have the freedom of inquiry to choose the religion you're for yourself, not be imposed. And even though he had no real connection to these Baptists, he just saw the religious intolerance that was rampant in Virginia at this particular point in time. That Baptist ministers had to get licensed. Their meeting houses had to be licensed also. And they'd be thrown in jail for doing no more than expressing their own opinions. Madison didn't necessarily share their religious opinions, but he and Jefferson saw that free inquiry was the premier principle. And whether your free inquiry then led you to religion, that's up to you. But for other people, it doesn't lead them to religion. So that's the predominant concern, is freedom of inquiry.
So in your book, I noticed that seemed to be the overriding theme, and religious freedom is just a subset of freedom of inquiry in general. But one thing I really appreciated about your book was, we know about these two men, but I didn't realize how close they were. They had a almost 50-year deep friendship together, bouncing off of each other, trading ideas. And I think the main question you raised in the book, which you try to answer, is why? Why did they care so much? Of all the issues, why did these two men care so much about religious freedom?
Now, that is a $64,000 question when it comes to it. And again, I think it goes back to what I was just saying. They believed so strongly in freedom of conscience, freedom of inquiry, wherever that led you. And so even though, as I say, Howard II men in the, who were the privileged class, they were nominal Anglicans, so their own religious beliefs would not be questioned. They were the last people who would be subject to any kind of religious persecution during the late colonial period. But still they saw how this concept of freedom of inquiry applied across the board. They also were very much troubled, though, by the corruption that existed within the established churches, in the majority churches. And they saw them as really almost being the enemy sometime in trying to clamp down on the ability of people to think for themselves. So on one hand, it was to support people who wanted to have the freedom of inquiry, but on the other, it was this concern about the long, long history, which they knew so much about religious intolerance and persecution, that if you didn't try to cabin that it would come back and maybe take over and potentially even threaten the new American Republic.
Well, it's certainly threatened now. How would you describe Jefferson and Madison's religious views? Did Jefferson or Madison reject many of the core tenets of biblical Christianity?
There is no question that Thomas Jefferson rejected many of the core tenets. He's been called many things. He certainly leaned in deistic thought, like Thomas Paine. He did not go quite that far, but he rejected the miracles. He rejected the divinity of Jesus, all those types of core doctrinal principles. The Bible was not inspired in his mind. In fact, one of the things he did famously later in life is he took some Bibles and he goes with scissors, and I don't think they had tape back then, I guess it was glue, and he cuts out all parts of the Bible that he thinks is just totally superstitious, myths, etc. And he creates what's called the Jefferson Bible, where he gets down to the purity of what Jesus taught, but he believed Jesus was just a great moral philosopher.
Yeah, he cut out all of the, we saw that Bible in Washington, D.C., the Jefferson Bible. He cut out
Actually,
all
I have a copy of it. My wife gave me a copy for Christmas several years ago, which I thought was very appropriate for a Christmas gift.
The way I was raised, that would have been sacrilege, to take the Word of God and cut it into pieces. And but he was fearless, huh?
Well, he was, although he was sensitive because he was attacked very much for his heretical beliefs. So far as Madison, he is a mystery. He's kind of an enigma. He does not put his neck out in the same way that Thomas Jefferson does about his own personal religious beliefs. But when you read between the lines, you can see very much that he was pretty much in lockstep with Thomas Jefferson.
And Jefferson, I understand, was quite anti-clerical. Would you say the same thing of Madison?
Madison wasn't quite as anti-clerical. In fact, one of the places I mentioned in the book where there is this great collaboration is that in one of the several drafts that Thomas Jefferson made for a new constitution in Virginia during the founding period, he expressly put in a provision where ministers could not hold any public office. And Madison writes, and Jefferson asked Madison to review his draft. Madison writes back and says, I like most of what you say, but you should take this part out because I think it's just going to cause more damage and more harm than it's worth to exclude that. But then also he was doing it for kind of a philosophical reason too. He said, we should not exclude anybody from public office regardless of what their beliefs are. That has ramifications on the other side.
Yeah, because no religious test for public office is in the Constitution.
Yeah. One way or the other.
Yeah.
That was Madison's idea.
So you write that our sense of religious freedom was largely developed in Virginia. Why Virginia?
Well, Virginia was the largest colony. It also had the most entrenched religious establishment. There was actually more persecution in Virginia than any other state. And so consequently, and many of the leading founders came from Virginia. So Virginia really was kind of the model that many other states looked to. And so consequently, for Virginia to go out front when it comes to these ideas of religious freedom, not saying all other states copied it, but it kind of set the standard. It set where the bar should be. on the way we go about thinking about religious freedom. And you do see other states like Tennessee, Kentucky, later states joining the Union, who actually then do parrot many things that were in the Virginia Constitution.
Wasn't it even, it seemed to me that they had laws at one point where priests couldn't even enter the state. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, in the colonial period, they actually did exclude Puritans because it was an Anglican colony. They had a fine of, I think it was up to £100, which today would be thousands and thousands of dollars, if you facilitated any Quakers coming into the colony. And so, yeah, that's what an establishment means. It's not just funding the major religion, it is persecuting dissenting religions.
Exactly.
And there was a debate about Anglican bishops coming into the colony, wasn't there?
Well, that was highly controversial throughout the colonies, not just in Virginia. The Church of England claimed that it was the established church throughout the colonies, notwithstanding that the Puritans, the Congregationalists, were in control in New England and whatever. And so consequently, they believed that they should be the ones who get the benefit, get the privilege. But there was not an American bishop. The Bishop of London controlled the Anglican Church in the colonies. And there was a big movement right before the Revolution to create an American bishopric. And today we just think, let them have a bishop if they want to. But when you have a bishopric in a place back then, it came with ecclesiastical courts. It came with, again, all the other trappings and the laws that supported the establishment that were extremely oppressive. And so that was one of the things that actually did fuel some of the revolutionary spirit, was this rejection of this idea that there should be an American Anglican bishop.
We are speaking with Stephen K. Green, an expert in constitutional law and the principle of separation between state and church. And when we come back, we want to talk about how religious freedom is increasingly endangered in the United States.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm Charlotte, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I've always been intrigued by religion, and when I was younger, I desperately wanted to be religious, to be more accepted by my family, who was in majority Catholic. My parents didn't raise me religious. I was never baptized. I never took communion. Well, once I took communion. It was a pretty bad idea. I don't think it was worth a church full of angry elderly who glared at me as I waved the communion wafer back and forth asking my grandma what should be done with it. Also, the wine was pretty gross. From this experience and countless others, I came to 3 conclusions that sort of dictate how I live my secular life. One is that I find people of faith to be more exclusionary and less accepting. 2 is that I would rather work to please the people around me who I care about than someone who, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. And 3, that I would rather help people than pray for them.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. Our guest is Professor Stephen K. Green, an expert in constitutional law governing the separation between state and church. His latest book is called The Grand Collaboration, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the Invention of American Religious Freedom.
So, Professor Green, you make a distinction between religious freedom and religious liberty. What's that distinction?
Well, for me, that distinction is the difference between many people will say, I want my religious freedom, but they're really talking about, I want my ability to kind of exercise my religion regardless of what those ramifications may be for other people, other individuals. And so I like to use the term religious freedom. It incorporates the idea of religious free exercise. It incorporates the idea of my liberty. But it's a larger principle that also has a structural quality to it to ensure that we do have a secular society, to ensure that we do have separation of church and state. And quite clearly, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were not solely concerned about allowing Baptists to preach. That was part of what they were fighting for. But they were also fighting for a larger concept of freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry. And that encompasses more than just this narrower concept of free exercise of religion.
So religious freedom is societal and religious liberty is personal, individual.
More
then.
personal.
So unfortunately, Trump is talking about religious freedom in some of his recent executive orders. He's adopting that term. Before we talk about this fascinating history that you've uncovered, which is so important because the Supreme Court is now saying the test about whether something is unconstitutional is whether it's historical and traditional. So we really need people to understand the history. Let's talk about the present and future of this besieged principle of secular government. What are your thoughts on how religious freedom is being weaponized?
Well, it's definitely being weaponized. And I've always argued that I'm not an originalist, but the framers, Madison in particular, put in these two principles in the First Amendment, free exercise but non-establishment. And they saw them as complementing each other. But necessarily one should not have a prior position over the other. What we've been seeing now with the current Supreme Court, really for the last 10, 15 years, is a minimizing, a diminishing of the non-establishment principle, and then a real exaggeration of what it means to have a religious liberty interest, a religious liberty right. And it's almost a carte blanche or a get out of jail free card, if I can use that term, for people to exempt themselves from any kind of beneficial regulation. And so we see entities like Hobby Lobby, which is a huge corporation for profit. But just because the people who own it disagree with certain types of contraceptives and abortions, they can be exempt from it on a religious ground. Same thing with bakers, photographers, a whole host of people who are engaged in business and are technically what we call public accommodations. They're subject to non-discrimination laws. But they can, whenever they want to, all of a sudden say, I have a religious objection to serving a particular clientele, so therefore exempt me from all these laws.
And your religious liberty gives you a right to discriminate against others,
gives you a right
too.
to discriminate, but also to trump these otherwise valuable laws that help society operate and ensure that there is equality. And so that's what we're seeing the current Supreme Court doing. And now, of course, they've basically just opened the door to any kind of funding of religious instruction, religious institutions, which is completely anathema to what Jefferson and Madison were trying to achieve. We've gone 180 degrees from what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah. And you write about that Jefferson would not have agreed with this public accommodation. The Civil Rights Act, he would have agreed with that and disagreed with the weaponization of religion. You mentioned history. Isn't the Supreme Court supposed to be aware about the history? Don't they know about the views of our founders, especially Jefferson and Madison?
Jefferson and Madison have always been controversial for religious conservatives. And because, in essence, they more than anybody were significantly behind this idea of separation of church and state. So there is an inconsistency there, Dan. You're exactly right. That on one hand, the Supreme Court is now claiming we're going to go back to looking at the history and traditions of what occurred during the founding period. But because so many of them don't like what Madison and Jefferson were advocating, they're more or less saying, they weren't representative of the founding period. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is to show, even though maybe they were at the forefront, they had a lot of support. They couldn't have gotten the matters through that they did if they had not had a cast of characters, so to speak, who supported them. So they were at the forefront, but they were not outliers. Then the other thing they often say, the conservatives often say, conservatives often then say, well, they really weren't as separationist as you claim they are. And so that was another thing I wanted to kind of look at in the book, and to basically say, we all have sometimes inconsistencies, but we need to look at generally all their work. I looked at close to all of the 2,300 letters between the two of them, many of them about religious matters. And even though there may have been a few blips here in the way, generally speaking, they were as consistent as you could ever think when it came to separation of church.
Well, because Madison drafted the First Amendment, but it had to go through Congress, didn't it?
Well, that's the other thing.
And
he did not have complete say on what it would be.
Yeah.
But still, my bottom line is, even though maybe there are other people we should look at the founding period, if you want to do history and traditions, you can't ignore these two people. They mattered more than anybody else.
Yes. So I didn't realize till your book that Madison's original words in his draft of the First Amendment were changed by Congress from prohibiting the full and equal rights of conscience to prohibiting free exercise of religion. And I have to say, I so much prefer the original wording. What about you?
Well, I do too. I think it's a shame. He was really pushing for a broader concept, I think, than the ultimate language ended up being in the First Amendment.
So in the minute left, any words of advice about this crossroads we find ourselves in with state-church separation so endangered?
Well, I think those of us who are separationists, we need to just continue to persist about the positive values of separation of church and state, because what the conservatives have been rather successful in doing is characterizing it somewhat as a negative value, and as a value that tries to put down people of faith. And we need to be continually reaffirming how separation of church and state helps society work, and it's a valuable concept. It keeps the government out of religious matters as much as it keeps religious matters out of government.
Hear, hear.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Green. It's a wonderful book, The Grand Collaboration. Thanks for being with us today.
And thanks for all your work to document the true history of religious freedom. And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.